continued support of the Wyoming State Archives Speaker Series. I'm Mauva Everett. I work for the State Archives, and I'd like to take a moment and introduce a couple of people here with us this evening. In the back, with her trying to hide her face, is Sarah Davis, our state archivist. And then over here on the computer is Susie Taylor. She's one of our reference archivists. She'll be doing technical support and online moderator for tonight's program. I just have a few housekeeping items. Please be certain to sign in. If you haven't signed in when you came in, please be sure to before you leave. Please take a moment and silence your cell phones. Restrooms are out the door back by the elevators. We also have remote viewers for this program. For anyone online and in person, we'll have questions at the end of the program. For our viewers online, your mics and video will be turned off during the presentation, but you'll be able to turn them on during questions. You should raise your hand using the icon at the bottom of the screen, and Susie will call on you. Or if you prefer not to appear in the recording, you may ask your question in the chat section and Susie will read it. This program is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Tonight's presenter is a Wyoming author, Rodger McDaniel. He's presenting his most recent book, Profiles in Courage, Standing Against the Wyoming Wind. Rodger will cover the main theme of the book, courageous stories of the pressures experienced by 9 individuals and 3 groups of citizens of Wyoming. He'll also have copies available for sale at the end of the program. Rodger's a University of Wyoming has a University of Wyoming law degree and a Master of Divinity degree with honors from Iliff School in Theology in Denver, Colorado. He served 10 years in Wyoming legislature, practiced law for 25 years, and pastors at Highlands Presbyterian Church in Cheyenne. He was the author of 4 other books and was the 2000 fellow at the College of Preachers, National Cathedral, Washington, D.C., now Cathedral College of Faith and Culture. He's also invited a special guest to entertain us prior to the program. I'll let him introduce him, and I'll turn it over to Rodger.
All right.
Kind of cool, dude.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Robin and Susie and Sarah, for the arrangements tonight. I want to say that I've written 4 books, and during this is the 5th one. And during that time, I've spent a lot of time with these folks here at Wyoming Archives. This place is a gem. If you've had an opportunity to do some research here, you know what I mean, how helpful they are, and the extensive collections that they have on Wyoming history. So I want to thank them for all that they've meant to me in these years of writing. Before we start talking about the book, we're going to have a song. My friend Rick Spencer here is, he and I we're childhood friends. Yeah. Known him longer than probably anybody else in my life. Rick was a firefighter for many years, and he now is a songwriter. Yeah. He and his wife Diane looked at my book and said, "Oh, I think that I could make a song out of that." I passed out the lyrics. You're not expected to sing along. Right. If you feel like it, just jump right in. But the song is called Against the Wyoming Wind, and Rick is here to perform it for the first time.
Thank you, Rodger. Yeah, I don't know about the acoustics in this place or how strong my voice is anymore, but I'll give it a good shot here.
Very nice. I love the words. And Rick, thank you so much. You and Diane honored me with this. Thank you. And thanks for being here tonight to share it with everybody. I want to start with the words that begin chapter 1 of the book. In most books, chapter 1 would be called the introduction. But I have this obsession about even numbers, and if it was the introduction, there would be 11 chapters. So I had that 12 chapters, right? So the introduction is actually chapter 1. And it starts with words from John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. He wrote, "A nation which has forgotten the quality of courage, which in the past has been brought to public life, is not as likely to insist upon or regard that quality in its chosen leaders today, and in fact, we have forgotten." The book is bookended with that quote. The last chapter of the book ends with Liz Cheney's experience. And the chapter ends as the voters go to the polls on primary election day. And the words that Kennedy wrote in 1956 seem not only appropriate to start the book, but to finish it in that context. I first read Profiles in Courage when I was in junior high, and read it again in high school. We studied it, and over the years it's been on my bookshelf, and every few years I would pull it down and read part of it or all of it. And I did that in 2019. And when I finished it, I thought to myself, there's a Wyoming book here. It is time to recall for people the courage of some of the people who came before in Wyoming history, because they have exhibited extraordinary courage. And so I began in 2019 to write this book, and then COVID hit, and COVID shut down everything. Couldn't get an interlibrary loan. The American Heritage Center at the university was shut down. All the libraries, Wyoming Archives, I think, was shut down for a while, but not as long as most. They reopened here earlier, but I recall during this period, I was trying to write the chapter on Joel Mowney, and so the American Heritage Center said, "Well, we can help you. You can't come in and go through the boxes like you normally do, but if you'll tell us what you want to read, we'll have an intern hold it up to the screen on a Zoom call." That lasted about half a session. That wasn't going to work, and so we weren't able to work on it for a while. Finally, things began to open up, and I got back into it. And the issue that I initially struggled with, because you got to make choices about who's going to be in the book, whose stories are you going to tell. And I quickly realized that would depend on me, first of all, defining what I mean by courage, because that word means a lot of things to a lot of people. There are many who believe the people who raided the Capitol on January 6th were courageous. And so how do you define courage if you're going to identify the stories that you want to tell in a book like this? I came across an article in a 2000 publication called Wyoming History News. Some of you may be familiar with it. But in 2000, at the beginning of the new century, the Associated Press asked a dozen Wyoming historians to review the 20th century in Wyoming and decide what they thought to be the 10 most important stories of the century. Of course, by 2000, Wyoming history, that was almost all of Wyoming history. And so identifying the 10 most important stories was really an important task. And, these were people like Mike Massey and Phil Roberts and 10 others, historians from all across the state. And what they decided in the end was that the number one most significant story of the century was the ill treatment of women in Wyoming history. Then a second of the remaining 9 stories was the poor treatment meted out to cultural and racial minorities in Wyoming over that 100 years. And a third one was the poor treatment of indigenous peoples. And when I read that, the light went on. My theological roots brought back the words of the ancient Hebrew prophets. as they berated kings for oppression and injustice. And so I thought to myself that the term courage, when used to identify people whose stories I would tell in this book, had to be applied in a way that they were people who in some respect fought for those who were oppressed and fought for justice, for as allies for people in Wyoming who were marginalized. And so that helped me focus the book a little bit more. I can tell you that it was the most difficult book I've written, and yet the most joyous. Some of these people I knew personally. I worked on Tino Roncalio's staff for 7 years. His last 7 years in Congress. Jaron Artery I knew quite well, and Vicki and Sissy Goodwin and Tom Bell. But when you dig into their papers and their speeches and their letters, and you talk to old friends, you learn things that you didn't know. And so it was fun doing that. And if you've done that kind of research where you sit down with those old dusty boxes and go through these papers, I don't know what future historians are going to do with electronic records, because it ain't near as fun as going through those papers. It reminds me of a funny story. When I wrote Gail McGee's biography, I went to the American Heritage Center, and they had 1,100 boxes of papers. He was a historian above all, and he kept everything. I mean, his old third grade report cards. And I said to myself, you're not going to be able to go through 1,100 boxes. So let's start with ones that look important. And so about the second week of that, I was going through one of these old banker's boxes, and there was a very thin file that somebody had handwritten on it, diabetes. Well, Senator McGee suffered from diabetes most of his life, and at times it was debilitating. And so I thought, well, this is something to look at. So I opened up this file, and the first thing I find is a letter from Gail McGee written in 1939 to his draft board saying that he would refuse to serve if the United States went to war in Europe, that he was a conscientious objector and would not join the military. And then you followed a few of these letters and you get to Pearl Harbor. And within days of Pearl Harbor, he writes back to his draft board and says, I want to serve if you change my draft status. So they changed it to 1A. He wanted to be a Navy pilot. And so he tried to enlist in the Navy. And that's when they found that he had diabetes, and it kept him out of the service. So that's why you have this file marked diabetes, which has all this wonderful stuff in it. So I said, well, if you're going to write this book, you're going to have to go through 1,100 boxes. and it was, as it was with the people that I write about in this book. Tom Bell, for example, any of you remember Tom Bell? Tom Bell is the godfather of the Wyoming environmental movement. Tom was born in Lander, grew up in Fremont County, went to war, was a war hero, came home. As a child, he had developed this love affair with the land and the water and the rocks and the birds, the animals. And so he began to look at Wyoming in terms of environmental issues. And I won't tell the whole story, but eventually he starts something called High Country News, which I suspect many of you have read or subscribed to. He created something called the Wyoming Outdoor Council, which is the oldest, largest environmental organization yet today in Wyoming. And he was on the front line fighting for environmental issues at a time when few people cared about the environment. In state government, there was no environmental protection function. The only office relevant to that was the Office of Economic Development. And their job was to bring in mining companies and pipelines and power plants and so water projects. And so Tom Bell clashes with Stan Hathaway, who was the governor at the time. And they really clashed. And it was when Stan Hathaway left the governorship after his successor was elected. He was about ready to walk out the door at his last day in office, and somebody from one of the newspapers says to him that, now that you're no longer governor, what are you going to do? He said, I'll tell you the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive to Lander and I'm going to punch Tom Bell in the nose. But those kinds of anecdotes and more serious ones are throughout the book. I think you'll enjoy particularly reading about people you know, but also getting to know people that you haven't. 3 or 4 weeks ago, we did an event at the Albany County Library. My wife and Pat, who is back in the back there, and I went through the whole book, whole table of contents, talked about each person in the book. And we left and got in the car to go home, and she said, "Don't ever do that again." But I do hope you enjoy the book. It starts off with the story of Jaron Artery. Any of you know Jaron? A few of you do. Jaron grew up in Wheatland, Wyoming. And from a very early age, he realized that he had an attraction to boys and felt that he was probably gay. The problem was that he lived in Wheatland, Wyoming. And his uncle preached at the local Christian church. And every Sunday morning, the family would be in church. And frequently on those Sunday mornings, Jaron remembered his uncle preaching sermons about how gay people are an abomination and they are doomed to burn in hell for all eternity. And that's how he grew up. And if you can imagine the impact of something like that coming not just from a preacher, but a preacher who is your beloved uncle. And so Jaron, from a very early age, realized that he was probably doomed to hell. And he spent many, many nights worrying about it, laying in bed thinking about how to avoid this. And he's like 9 years old when he decides that the best way to die would be in a plane crash, because you would realize the plane was going down and you would have enough time to repent before it hit the ground. And you would therefore not be doomed to all eternity in burning. That's how he dealt with it. And he spent many years in the closet, married, had children, divorced, went to the University of Wyoming, and then he ended up in Cheyenne working for New York Life, which he still does to this day. But he learned about something called Wyoming Equality, which is an organization that advocates for the rights of the LGBTQ community. And so he met people there and they invited him in. And you know what it's like with organizations. When you show any interest, pretty soon you're the lead volunteer. And so a couple of weeks after he joins, he gets a call. They want him to go to the Capitol building to lobby against a bill that was introduced in 2011 to outlaw same-sex marriages and to say that the state of Wyoming would not recognize the same-sex marriage if it was legal in the state where it was consummated. And so he went up to lobby, and it was his first experience in politics. Talk about the lamb to the wolves. And he, for the first time, experienced the hateful words of people who couldn't understand the LGBTQ community. One of the lobbyists for the Catholic diocese approached him and told him that, "I'm worried, Jaron, about your colon." It was that kind of thing he ran into constantly in committees, outside committees. But he was successful in killing the bill. And that got him excited about politics. And so he then got much more involved. And to make a long, interesting story short, at one point he decides, why continue to fight these battles in the Wyoming legislature? You know, many of you have had experience in the legislature, as I have, from one capacity to another. But, you know, in the legislature, they're not under oath. They don't have to tell the truth. They don't have to have facts. But in courts, they do. So Jarrett said, why don't we go to court? Surely it's a constitutional question about equal rights. And so the issue ends up before the federal court. And lo and behold, the federal court judge in Casper rules that the Wyoming Constitution protects the right of people to marry who they choose to marry. About the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court made the same ruling. But without Jaron leading that cause, I have no question in my mind that that battle would not have been. So he's the first chapter, followed by Tom Bell and others. Millward Simpson, who risked his governorship and in fact lost his governorship because of his opposition to the death penalty. 1957, there's an awful murder in Wheatland. A fellow who thought he was going to marry this woman. A woman had different ideas and was with a different man, and he killed them both. A jury trial, and he's convicted, and he's ordered to die in the death chamber. Two other people about the same time had committed murders, and they were also convicted and sentenced to death. And Governor Simpson said, you know, I understand the feeling of the people of Wyoming, but my moral belief is that the state should not put people to death. And so I will not put anybody to death on my watch. And then in January of the election year, he's running for re-election against a Democrat named Joe Hickey. And in January, not long before the election, a guy named Charles Starkweather comes to life. Anybody remember Charles Starkweather? Charles Starkweather was perhaps the first mass murderer in America. And he started his murder spree in Nebraska, killed family members and others. And he and his girlfriend, who was 14 at the time, drive across Nebraska, commit another murder en route, and then they drive into Wyoming. And outside of Douglas, he murders somebody else. When you go back and read the newspapers from that time, people were scared to death. Huge headlines in the Cheyenne and Casper paper about Starkweather is now in Wyoming. And people were really on edge, as you can imagine in those days. People even started locking their front door. But it was a real sensational thing, and he gets caught up by Douglas. And the Converse County attorney runs off to the courthouse and files a first-degree murder charge and says he's going to ask for the death penalty. Now, Millward Simpson could have decided to ride this out because the trial was way down the road. In all likelihood, the verdict would come after the election. He could have stayed out of it, but he didn't. And he announced in February of election year, if the DA gets a conviction and the judge orders Mr. Starkweather to be executed, I will commute the sentence. So they dismissed the charge in Converse County, extradited him to Nebraska, tried him, and executed him. But the courage there were other issues involved. He had also put an end to open gambling in Teton County, which was hugely controversial. And then there was an interstate, some of you may remember days without interstate highways. I remember, if you drove to Casper, you had to drive through Chugwater and through Wheatland and through Douglas and through Glenrock into Casper. And you would stop along the way maybe and buy a lunch or a pair of cowboy boots or hat, whatever. But it was an economic matter for these small towns when the interstate system was being developed, that many of these little towns were being bypassed and hurt economically. So there was a huge controversy in North Wyoming about where Interstate 90 would be located. And Simpson refused to intervene in the decision made by the Wyoming Highway Commission. And as a result, was in trouble there. So it could have been, he didn't lose by more than about 3,000 votes. An election that close, there are a lot of reasons. Death penalty, interstate highway, gambling in Jackson. All three of the decisions, though, reflected his moral fiber. He stood up to folks. And when he died, his widow at the funeral home with Alan and Pete Simpson there said a prayer. And she said, may his integrity be passed along to his sons. And it was. Alan's story is told in the book too. When George Bush was nominated for president in 1988, he wanted Al Simpson to be the vice presidential nominee. And he had vetted him through the whole process. And as everything with Simpson has some humor, reading his responses to all those questions that he had to answer, there's some humor in that. But at some point in time, a group of high-ranking Republicans went to George Bush and said, if you nominate Al Simpson, we'll walk out of the convention. Because Alan had risked it all in his support of choice for women and rights for the LGBTQ community. And so it was unacceptable. And that's how we got Dan Quayle. It could have been worse. In my research, what I found is that as George Bush was trying to figure out who to nominate, since Simpson's name could not be on the list, Jim Baker, remember Jim Baker was his right-hand man. Jim Baker later said the next possibility that was seriously considered was Clint Eastwood. And he said they're very serious. People around Bush were lobbying very hard to get that done. So history is interesting. But I do hope you'll read the book. I think, let me read just a little more of the opening and then the closing, and then we'll take some questions. In the opening, I write, in the iconic opening chapter of Centennial, James Michener offers readers a lesson on geology. Among other things, he teaches that the Wyoming Wind was a big player in the formation of the land. Before humans walked the earth, the Rocky Mountains were formed in part by the winds blowing incessantly across the northern plains. He chronicled how, quote, high winds whip over the prairies, exhausting the land and everything that grows up on it, end quote. Even today, the winds here are said to be among the strongest in the nation. The wind pattern most often from west to east. Where the wind blows strongest, damage to a few buildings that dot the prairie is not uncommon. Depending on the stature of the victim, it has been known to blow some folks off their feet. Wyoming is also known for its political winds. They too blow hard, whipping across the land, exhausting everything and everyone attempting to stand against it. They form the social, economic, academic, and political landscape, just as prehistoric winds formed the mountains and the plains. From wherever you stand, they usually blow hardest from the right and are frequently strong enough to blow people who venture from the beaten path off their feet. As often as not, those who stand against the Wyoming Wind are racial, religious, and other ethnic or cultural minorities or their allies and advocates. And then that introduction ends with this. This book is about the flashes of courage these women and men exhibited when it mattered most. This book is written to resurrect those moments and to restore the meaning of courage as an honored attribute in Wyoming politics. There has never been another time in the state's history when the winds blew stronger against those who would otherwise act courageously than we witness today. It follows that there was never a time when recognizing political courage was more important. Any questions or comments? I know some of you had a chance to read the book and be interested in reactions. Roz?
Who are the 13 people we talked about?
Well,
I know Pat
Let
doesn't
me
want
tell
you
you.
to go through bio.
well, the first is Jaron, Tom Bell, the Black 14. And I want to say a word about that. How many of you were in Wyoming during the Black 14? Quite a few. I was as well. I worked at a radio station then. I was covering it for the news, but at small radio stations, you do that and you play records and you clean the bathroom. But I was sent to Laramie to interview people and was quite interested in the issue, as most of the state was. But there was something considerably different about looking back over all these decades that have passed since then and looking at it from a variety of angles, reading the papers of the university president and the board of trustees, listening to the oral interviews with the Black 14 and some of the coaching staff, and reading the news accounts at the time. And I got to tell you that I was really blown away at the sense that I got, when you look back at it from this many years, look back at it and you see the chain of events and the voices that were being heard and the things that were being said. One day those boys were heroes. They were going to win a national championship. Those were the days when not everybody got to play in a bowl game. On New Year's Day, there were 4 bowl games. And the New Year's preceding all of this, Wyoming played the Sugar Bowl and nearly beat Florida. And there were high expectations in 1969 where that this team could win a national championship. And indeed, in some polls, they were in the top 10. So Wyoming how Wyoming is about Wyoming football. Well, when you had that kind of a team playing, it was really on fire. And they loved these kids. And the next day, they hated them. Next day, they went after them with a vengeance. Every power structure in the state, political, the media, the business community, the academic community, with some notable exceptions, by and large, all of them went after these kids. And one example was I found a pretty good size ad for the Wyoming Association of Insurance Agents, placed in the Cheyenne newspaper, thanking Lloyd Eaton for his courage in dismissing these kids and comparing them to the people who were rioting in the big cities across America and burning buildings down. And if we don't enforce the rules today, that's what we're going to have tomorrow. That was from the Wyoming Association of Insurance Agents. The newspaper editors, most of them, the one here in Cheyenne, Jim Flincham, said Lloyd Eaton could run for any office in Wyoming and be elected, and that was probably true. The chairman of George Wallace's presidential campaign came to Laramie to stand at the gate at a football game and hand out "We Love Lloyd Eaton" signs, Confederate flags in the grandstands. Just looking at this back all those years, that was really stunning to see. The others, Lynn Dickey. Some of you may have known Lynn. Lynn spent most of her life in a wheelchair and was an incredible activist. She is responsible for the Powder River Basin Resource Council, but did so much more. Some people refer to her as Joan of Arc and a steel stallion. She was in the Wyoming legislature for 3 terms. The next chapter is Sissy and Vicki Goodwin. Most of you know the Goodwins, I think. Sissy is the most famous cross-dresser in Wyoming history. His story is somewhat like Jaron's. He grew up in a horrifying environment. A stepfather and a mother who were horribly abusive, which later psychiatrist attributed to his cross-dressing because he found comfort in that. But what's interesting, Sissy for many, many years is in the closet, finally decides for his own mental health, he has to come out. He has to be who he is. And so he began going around Douglas and Casper with frilly dresses and blouses. And total strangers would walk up and beat the hell out of him. One day he's watering his lawn in Douglas, and a guy he had never seen before walks across the street and kicks his teeth in, literally kicks his teeth in. At an airport in Salt Lake City, a group of teenagers attacked him, almost ripped his ear off. And when he called the police arrested him. So the courage to be who you are, particularly when you are challenging gender norms, is pretty extraordinary. So his story is there. Joe Amani, who would have been a U.S. Supreme Court judge, that was his lifetime dream, until he bucked FDR on the court packing plan. And he got a note from FDR's chief of staff that says, loyalty is rewarded and disloyalty is punished. And so his dream was over. Tino Roncalio, many of you knew Tino. The Simpsons I've talked about. Then there's a chapter on the people of Wind River, the indigenous people. While I was writing that chapter, I read a book by a guy named Kent Nurburn. It's a fictional account of a relationship with a group of Native Americans. It's a wonderful story. But in the middle of that book, one of the characters, a Lakota woman, says to Nurburn, white men should not write stories about Indians. And I said, you know, that's probably true. But they couldn't be left out of this book either. The story is, one of the disadvantages we've had is that over time there haven't been many Native American writers. You know, their stories are oral. Their history is largely oral. But I spent a lot of time on that history, and I can tell you that I don't think you can spend a lot of time on the history of the people of Wind River without concluding that the agenda of our government was to exterminate every Native American. And you know, they almost got it done. And the problems on the reservation are still enormous. But the courage also shows through in a lot of ways. The next to last chapter is the people of Heart Mountain, for obvious reasons. The last chapter was to have been about Liz Cheney exclusively. But as I got into it, I thought you really can't understand Liz's courage unless you understand Wyoming political history as a whole. And so the book is a survey or a summary, Wyoming history going back to territorial days through the Constitutional Convention into the 20th century and to the present. And it's fascinating what you see when you look at it when you're trying to get that 30,000 foot view of those 140 some odd years. You know, we start off in 1868 giving women the right to vote. And in 1869, they tried to take it away and came within one vote of overriding the governor's veto of getting it done. 1890 is the Constitutional Convention, 1889. Wyoming is writing its first state constitution. And they get off into, first of all, some of them wanted to repeal women's suffrage again. Want to go after that again. And then they get into the question of whether or not those Negroes from the South who are coming here ought to be allowed to vote. Because some of the leaders of the convention said they are ruining the South, these ignorant Negroes, and if they come here, they'll do the same to Wyoming. So Wyoming ends up in its constitution having a literacy requirement for voting that was on the books until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ruled all of those illegal. But then you get into the early 1900s, and enormous influence from the Ku Klux Klan all over Wyoming, particularly in the Bighorn Basin and Fremont County, signs regularly on banks and motels, restaurants, no Indians allowed, no blacks allowed, no Mexicans allowed. A Wyoming historian named Gunther did a study of lynching in Wyoming during that period of time, and he concluded that per capita, Wyoming lynched more African Americans during that period than Mississippi. Not uncommon to see a black man hanging from a telephone pole in Cheyenne or Laramie or Casper or where have you. Then we get to the Great Depression, where Wyoming is one of the last states to accept federal help. The Wyoming newspapers chronicle how kids in Wyoming are undernourished and starving, and the legislature would refuse to take any of the federal help they were the last state to do that. Then you get to pre-World War II days, and for World War II days, you get Heart Mountain. That experience. Following the war, you get the McCarthy era, and the McCarthyism directly responsible for the suicide of one of Wyoming's most popular governors and senators, Lester Hunt, who soon McCarthyism is replaced with Bircherism and the John Birch Society through the 50s and into the 60s. Part of the last chapter is about the partnership between John Kennedy and Gail McGee in trying to figure out how to fight the Birchers. And so that stretches through the 60s. Wyoming was in the top 10 per capita membership of the John Birch Society. If you've been here a while, you remember the big billboards, impeach Earl Warren and get US out of the UN. Those were the Birchers all over the state. There's kind of a lull in the 70s. Then you get into the 80s, and a fellow named Harlan Edmonds comes to Wyoming. Harlan was a Department of Defense contractor, comes to Wyoming because he thinks his impression of Wyoming is that this is a conservative's paradise. And he gets here and he finds that there are a lot of moderate Republicans. And so he starts an organization called Conservative Republicans of Wyoming. And this was the beginning of the purity era, where Republicans increasingly judged one another about how pure Republicans they are. You get an organization called Y Watch, which existed for a few years primarily to fight against LGBTQ rights. Liberty Group comes along. And so by the time 2016 rolls around, Wyoming has had this history of flirtation with right-wing extremism. And so when Trump comes along, it's interesting, in 2016 at the Republican State Convention, when they chose their delegates to the National Convention, Trump lost. Ted Cruz was the winner. And I find this in the archives, a CNN interview, where for the first time, Donald Trump says, if I lost, it's because the election was rigged. He said the Wyoming Republicans were all crooks. They rigged the election. I can't go to Wyoming because they expect me to pay people off. But after he was nominated, everybody endorses him. And of course, Trump wins big here. And Liz Cheney in that campaign is quoted as saying about Hillary Clinton much the same thing she would say about Donald Trump in subsequently. Hillary ought to be locked up, she's crooked, and she's not qualified to be president. And then we get to the impeachment. Liz supports Trump on the impeachment, first one. But then comes the post-election period after 2022. And when he starts talking about all of the election fraud, she simply says, if he has evidence, he ought to produce and that puts her on the bad side. And so then she votes for impeachment the second time around. And the January 6th thing was really the breaking point. And there's a wonderful description of what happens that day. The salty language she uses when she runs into Jim Jordan on the steps of the Capitol. But what happens then is in 2018, she won 73rd. And then after she turns against Trump, 2022, she loses 73rd. Just a complete reverse. But she is the last chapter, along with Lester Hunt, in a discussion about McCarthyism and Gail McGee and Berkshires. So that's the list. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm sort of amusing myself by asking whether Governor Stan Hathaway would have made the courageous list if he had back to 514. That led me to a thing. Where the 13 or the 14, 15, 16, 17 finishers you almost put it.
Well, I only mentioned the dead ones. I would have liked to have included Ernie Wilkerson. Remember Ernie Wilkerson? Ernie Wilkerson was a Democrat who ran for governor in 1966 when Hathaway ran for his first term. And in my view, it's because of Ernie Wilkerson that Wyoming got a severance tax. Wilkerson proved to Hathaway in that campaign that most people in Wyoming were supporting a severance tax. And so when Ernie loses and Hathaway is elected, Hathaway institutes the first severance tax. But Wilkerson did other things too. He was a vocal opponent of the war in Vietnam. Somebody firebombed his home in Casper because of his statements on the Vietnam War. But one of the practical problems I had is that he left no papers behind. There wasn't enough information to write a chapter, which is too bad. I think it would have been interesting. You know, there are others. Margaret Laybourne would have been a chapter. So, Mako Miller. Anybody remember Mako Miller? Mako Miller was from Casper. Her great debates during Vietnam with Gail, she drove Gail McGee crazy. And she was so adamant about it. When I wrote McGee's biography, I went to meet with her. This was probably 2 years before she died. We had lunch at a little restaurant in Casper. And I asked her about those days. And she started talking about Vietnam. And she literally broke down sobbing and could not continue for several minutes. It so deeply impacted her emotion. So she took it out on McGee, who was, McGee was the conscience. Wouldn't his opponents love to have found that file when he was in office? Conscientious objector became the biggest hawk on Vietnam in the U.S. Senate. Anyone else?
Rodger, could you talk a little bit about Lester Hunt? Because as you and I have spoke together,
Yeah.
I grew up in Wyoming, and that was not a topic that went great Wyoming history at all. So, talk a little bit about
Yeah, I will. You know, Lester Hunt, I had heard, in fact, Rick Ewig had written an article for Annals of Wyoming that talked about Hunt's suicide, and that was written in, you guys can remember it, early 2000s. And it was pretty startling to me. I had been involved in Democratic Party politics for years, spent hours with Tino on the road traveling. And the most Tino ever said, I asked him about Lester Hunt. He said they treated him terribly. But nobody ever talked about his suicide or the allegation of about his son being gay. Those things were in the 50s were just verboten. You didn't talk about them. And after her husband's suicide, Mrs. Hunt made it her cause to make sure that story was never told. She did not want her son dragged through that mud again, and she didn't want her husband's image to be tarnished with talk about his suicide. And when T.A. Larson, I suppose many of you have read T.A. Larson's History of Wyoming. When Larson was writing that book, he sent a copy of the manuscript to Mrs. Hunt and said, I just want you to read this part about your husband. And basically it was the whole story about how he had been blackmailed by Senator Bridges and Senator from Idaho, and Joe McCarthy. And the Democrats controlled the Senate by 1 seat. And so when they learned that his son had been arrested for soliciting homosexual sex, they thought this was an opportunity. They would force Hunt out of the Senate, and the Republican governor back in Wyoming would replace him with a Republican, and the control of the Senate would switch. And so they launched this campaign against Senator Hunt. It was just brutal. For a year, he put up with this. And it included breaking into his home in Washington over Christmas and ransacking it while he was in Wyoming. Then they came up with an allegation that initially when Buddy was arrested, the charges were dismissed. They used their political pressure to get the charges reinstated. And then they came up with a narrative that Hunt had paid a bribe to the policeman to get the charges dismissed. And Joe McCarthy announced that he would open hearings on a colleague who had paid a bribe to get charges dismissed against his son. That was on Friday. And Friday morning, he took a rifle to his office at the Senate and shot himself to death. He was, I don't think there's any question, he was one of the most popular politicians in Wyoming. He served in the legislature, 2-term Secretary of State. He's responsible for the bucking horse license plate. He was governor during the war and was a very, among veterans, they thought of him very highly as being very supportive. And then in the U.S. Senate, he would have been, Estes Kefauver ran for the Democratic nomination in 1952, lost to Adlai Stevenson, but Kefauver said that if he was nominated, Lester Hunt would be his vice presidential candidate. So very popular, a good senator, and then this tragic thing happens. Quickly, at the time I learned about this, I was the director of the Department of Family Services, and I read that story. I thought somebody ought to write a book about Lester Hunt, but I certainly didn't have time to do it. When I retired, one day out of the blue, I get a Facebook friend request from Buddy Hunt, Lester's son and namesake, but they called him Buddy. And I said, give me your phone number. I want to call you. So I called him, and Margaret Laybourne, who's an old friend of his, was sending him copies of my weekly column from the newspaper. So he wanted to talk about some of that. And I told him, I always thought somebody should write your dad's biography. He said, why don't you do it? He said, if you want to get serious about doing that, come on out to Chicago. And so I did. I spent a week with him out there. Remarkable guy. He was a community organizer with a guy named Saul Alinsky, organized in the low-income parts of Chicago and New York and elsewhere. He went to the mountains in Cuba before the revolution there and taught literacy classes. He's just an incredible individual. And he told me that he wasn't gay. In fact, he had a long time. He died maybe 4 years ago. They had a marriage of 30-something years, had 2 wonderful daughters. And he told me that that night that he was arrested, he was experimenting with bisexuality. And at that time, there was the Kinsey report. Anybody remember the Kinsey report on human sexuality? It was about the same time, early 1950s. And it concluded from their studies that 36% of all American males had experimented with bisexuality. Buddy was one of them. But one other quick item about that was interesting. When I first met Buddy, he said, I said, Buddy, how have you dealt with this all these years? And he said, years of psychotherapy. He said, I was responsible for my father's suicide. And I said, well, I understand that you weren't, that it was a blackmail. And he said, how can you blackmail somebody with information that has been in all the newspapers? So when I started my research on the book, I kept that question in mind. It's an excellent question. And what I found is that in those days, nearly every newspaper in Wyoming was owned by Tracy McCracken, who was the Democratic Party National Committee man. And so the story did not get into many of the, I think of the 30 newspapers he owned, it was printed in two stories, or two papers, and one buried in the paper had a heading, Wyoming man convicted of morals charges. That was it. And in those days, if you missed the 6 a.m. news, there was no more news the rest of the day. The television was not available to most people. The Democratic National Committee man decided what appeared in most of the newspapers in the state. So the truth was, it really was not public information, which was why they made the threat that if Lester didn't resign from the Senate, they would put a flyer in every mailbox in Wyoming. They had this flyer printed up, looked like a wanted poster with Buddy's face on it, wanted for homosexuality reward. And so, so after the book, after he read the book, he called me to say thanks. He said, now I understand what happened. So fulfilling after all of those years. He was relieved of that, at least some of that maybe. Anyone else?
Do we have any questions online?
I have a question.
Yeah, Brenda.
Have you ever thought about doing a podcast with these stories? I'm a podcast listener because I can do it while I exercise.
Well, I'm lucky to get my email in the morning, but it would make a good podcast. It would make a good book study, a group book study, but a good, with these separate individual stories, it would make podcasts.
I could go get with somebody.
Yeah, who knows somebody?
I know somebody.
Well, I might talk to you. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate the Wyoming Archives for hosting me, and I appreciate your interest. If you're interested in a book, my wife will, she's the cashier. She'll be glad to sell you one. If you'd like it inscribed, I'd be glad to do that too. But I do hope, when I wrote the hunt book, somebody came to church Sunday after it was released, and he said to me, I have good news for you and I have bad news for you. And I said, well, let's start with the good news. He said, the good news is I read your book. I said, well, that's wonderful. Thank you. What's the bad? He said, I checked it out from the library. So even if you check it out at the library, I hope you'll read it. I think you'll enjoy these great stories. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very good. Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. Like Rodger said, they'll have books available for purchase out in the lobby. And please remember to join us next month on May 11th. Brooks Jordan from the Medicine Lodge Historic Site will do a presentation on that, on Medicine Lodge for us as partnering when we partner with state parks and historic sites. Thank you very much for coming. Truly.
Thank you.
Medicine Lodge is in Bighorn County up by Hyattville. Yeah, up by Hyattville. Does this go in the cabinet?